Today's theory topic is theories of growth. So there are basically 8 theories. First one is genetic theory, which was introduced by Brody. Second one is bone remodeling theory by Brash. Third theory is sutural theory, which was introduced by Fisher. Fourth one is cartilaginous theory, which was introduced by James Scott. Fifth one is the functional matrix theory, which was introduced by Melvin Moss. Sixth one is the servo system theory, which was introduced by Alexander Petrovic. Seventh one is a multifactorial theory, which was introduced by Van Limburg. And the last one is Enlow's expanding V principle. So we will be discussing about each theory in detail. First theory is the genetic theory, which was introduced by Alan Brody. And according to this theory, what he says is all growth is controlled by genetic influence and is pre-planned. Each organ, for example, maxilla, mandible, or even the cranial base, the magnitude of growth that has to be happening from the childhood till adulthood, all growth is controlled under the genetic concept. That is what genetic theory says. The second theory is sutural theory, which was introduced by Fisher. And according to this theory, what he says is sutures are the growth sites in the cranium or in the facial region. All the sutural areas are the main areas where the growth takes place. That is what Fisher says. So the main sutures of the craniofacial areas include frontozygomatic suture, frontomaxillary suture, nasomaxillary suture, zygomatico-maxillary suture, and frontonasal sutures. So these sutures are the areas where growth predominantly takes place. So when this theory was introduced, many points were raised against this theory. And one of the major factor is when an area of suture is transplanted to another location, that does not continue to grow. So this raised doubts regarding the main growth theory, that is a sutural theory. So another point is in untreated cases of cleft lip and palate, growth continues. So even in the absence of sutures also growth takes place. And another point is in cases of microcephaly and hydrocephaly also, even the sutures are present, even after the sutures are present, there is change in growth. So these points raise doubts against the sutural theory. Then comes the cartilaginous theory, which was introduced by James Scott. And according to this theory, what he says is cartilaginous portions of the craniofacial region are the primary growth centers. So the important cartilaginous points in the craniofacial region include the nasal septal cartilage, and in the mandible comes the condylar cartilage. So many points were favoring this theory. One point is when an area of cartilaginous junction is transplanted to another location, it continues to grow. So many points were favoring this theory. So after many years, after introduction of the cartilaginous theory, Melvin Moss came up with the functional matrix theory. And according to this theory, head is an area where several relatively independent functions are carried out in the craniofacial region. And some of these functions include respiration, olfaction, vision, hearing, chewing, swallowing, etc. So each of these function is carried out by functional cranial component, and the functional cranial component can be divided into a functional matrix and a skeletal unit. So all the tissues, organs, spaces includes the functional matrix, whereas the skeletal tissues related to specific functional matrix comprises the skeletal unit. So the functional matrix can be again divided into periosteal matrix and capsular matrix, and the skeletal unit can be divided into microskeletal unit and macroskeletal unit. So the example for microskeletal unit is maxilla and mandible. As we can see from when you look from the outside, we imagine maxilla and mandible as a single skeletal unit, but maxilla and mandible are made up of many small skeletal units that combine together to form the entire maxilla mandible. So for example, mandible comprises microskeletal units such as condylar process, coronoid process, angular process, body of the mandible, alveolar process of the mandible, etc. Similarly, maxilla is made up of alveolar process, basal part, pneumatic part, etc. So many microskeletal units are joined together to form the major part, that is maxilla and mandible. An example of macroskeletal unit is the entire endocranial surface of the calvarium. Next is functional matrix. Functional matrix can be again divided into periosteal matrix and capsular matrix. Periosteal matrices comprises all the tissues, organs, spaces, all together comprises the periosteal matrix. The periosteal matrices have a direct effect on the skeletal unit, thereby producing a secondary compensatory transformation in size and shape of the skeletal unit. That is, when there is expansion, when there is growth of the periosteal matrices, that is involved in the muscles, tissues, etc. As these tissues grow, there will be secondary growth, secondary transformatory growth in the form of bone remodeling, bone deposition and resorption in the skeletal units that lead to transformation of the particular skeletal unit. That is periosteal matrix, effect of periosteal matrix. Next comes the capsular matrix. Capsular matrix, examples of capsular matrix includes the neurocranial capsule and the orofacial capsule. The anatomy of the capsule is there will be an outer layer and inner layer, and inside the inner layer comprises the capsular matrix. And in case of orofacial capsule, the outer layer is the skin, inner layer is the mucosa, and the capsular matrix will be the orofacial air spaces. And between these two layers, there will be microskeletal units, all the tissues, organs, all comes under this, in between these two layers. So what functional matrix theory says is, as the functioning demand increases, as he or she grows, as maturation takes place, as functional demand also increases, these air spaces starts expanding. As the air spaces starts expanding, all the skeletal, microskeletal units, tissues, organs, that all sandwiched in between these two layers also gets displaced. So the effect of capsular matrix is secondary effect. That is, as the air spaces expands, all the skeletal parts also gets displaced. So there will be a secondary compensatory translation in size and shape of the skeletal units as a result of the expansion of the air spaces. So that's what functional matrix theory explains in case of periosteal matrix and capsular matrix. Periosteal matrix will have a direct effect on the skeletal units, thereby producing secondary compensatory transformation in size and shape of the skeletal unit, whereas capsular matrices produce a secondary compensatory translation in size and shape of the skeletal unit as a result of the expansion of the orofacial air spaces. For example, the coronoid process gets attached to the one of the masticatory muscle that is called temporalis. So as the function demand increases, for example, if the temporalis muscle is dissected or removed, the coronoid process, development of the coronoid process is diminished. So every skeletal part which is attached to, if there is any muscle attachment, once that muscles and all the surrounding tissues have a role in the growth of the skeletal units. That is what functional matrix theory tries to say. So that's all about functional matrix theory. So that's all about today's class. Thank you.